The Tudor court glittered like gold leaf under candlelight, but beneath the polished surface ran rivers of danger. Here, survival depended not only on bloodlines, but on wit, beauty, and the ability to navigate the shifting tides of royal favor. In this world of masks and daggers, Anne Boleyn rose from obscurity to become queen, and sealed her fate in the process. Born around 1501, Anne's childhood unfolded far from England's rigid hierarchies. She spent years in the courts of Burgundy and France, where she absorbed the refined culture of Renaissance Europe. Unlike many English women of her age, she became fluent in French, skilled in music, dance, and conversation. More importantly, she learned the art of charm as a weapon, the subtle game of wit and allure that could sway powerful men. When Anne returned to England, she was unlike any other woman at court. She was not the most traditionally beautiful, but she was arresting. Her dark eyes were said to hold a fire that unsettled even the boldest courtiers. She carried herself with confidence, daring even, in a court where women were expected to be ornaments, not players. Initially serving as lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, Anne quickly attracted notice. She danced with elegance, spoke with intelligence, and wielded fashion like a blade. Her French-influenced style, elaborate gowns, daring headdresses, and an unmistakable charisma made her stand out in Henry VIII's orbit. At first, Henry's interest in Anne seemed like the familiar story of a king's wandering eye. He had already taken mistresses, including Anne's own sister, Mary, but Anne was no passive conquest. She refused Henry's advances, rejecting gifts and letters, holding her ground against the most powerful man in England. This resistance only fueled his obsession. For years, Henry pursued her, showering her with love letters. Letters so revealing they are still preserved today in the Vatican archives. Anne, shrewd and calculating, transformed her no into leverage. She would not be his mistress, she insisted. If he wanted her, he must make her his queen. Henry, restless and desperate for a male heir, began to see Anne not only as a woman, but as the solution to his dynasty's survival. Catherine of Aragon had failed to provide him with a living son, and now Henry's fixation on Anne merged with his political need. Thus began the chain of events that would tear England from the Catholic Church and plunge it into decades of religious turmoil. The court watched in fascination and horror as Henry defied Pope Clement VII, casting aside his Spanish queen of 20 years for the bold young woman who would not bend. In 1533, after a secret marriage, Anne was crowned Queen of England in an extravagant ceremony at Westminster Abbey. For Anne, it was a moment of breathtaking triumph. She had climbed higher than any woman of her station could have imagined, and she bore herself with the proud knowledge of it. But already, shadows gathered. Many in England despised her, seeing her as the seductress who had broken apart a sacred marriage. Her sharp tongue earned her enemies among nobles and foreign ambassadors alike. Worse still, she failed to produce the one thing Henry desired above all else: a son. In September 1533, Anne gave birth not to the longed-for male heir, but to a daughter, the infant Elizabeth, who would one day become England's greatest queen. At the height of her coronation glory, Anne could not know that this very child, unwelcomed by her father, would survive to define the Tudor age. Nor could she know that her inability to give Henry a son would become the excuse for her destruction. The queen who had once seemed untouchable had already sown the seeds of her downfall. And at the center of it all was Henry VIII, a man whose love could transform into deadly hatred with terrifying speed. love is dangerous in the hands of a king. Henry VIII's passion, once Anne Boleyn's greatest weapon, soon became her deadliest threat. For when Henry loved, he moved mountains. But when that love soured, he destroyed without mercy. As queen, Anne wielded influence unlike any woman in Tudor England. She had Henry's ear in matters of politics and religion, openly quarreled with his advisors, and used her sharp tongue to intimidate rivals. Yet these very traits that had once captivated Henry now began to grate against him. The charm that had enthralled became arrogance in his eyes. Her cleverness, once admired, was recast as insolence. At court, whispers grew louder. Ambassadors wrote of her fiery temper, her scathing insults, and her tendency to mock those she disliked. Anne was feared, but not loved. And in the ruthless world of Tudor politics, fear alone could not sustain power. But the greatest wound of all was biological. Henry's obsession with a male heir gnawed at his soul. Catherine of Aragon had given him only a single surviving daughter, Mary. Now Anne, despite all her promises, fared little better. After Elizabeth's birth in 1533, Anne suffered multiple miscarriages. One, in 1536, was particularly devastating. She lost a male child, reportedly around 15 weeks old. Henry, superstitious and cruel, saw this as a divine judgment. The queen's value in his eyes diminished with every failed pregnancy. The same woman for whom he had broken from Rome now appeared cursed. Even worse, Anne began to sense Henry's gaze drifting elsewhere. Jane Seymour, one of her own ladies-in-waiting, emerged quietly but deliberately as Anne's rival. Unlike Anne, Jane was pale, demure, and submissive. Everything Henry now craved after years of fiery battles with his queen. Where Anne had challenged him, Jane bowed. Where Anne had spoken with wit, Jane murmured softly. Jane became the antidote to Anne's defiance. For Anne, this was more than betrayal. It was mortal danger. Queens who lost their king's love did not simply fade into the background. They were erased. Yet it was not Henry alone who sealed Anne's fate. Another figure lurked in the shadows, Thomas Cromwell, the king's ruthless chief minister. Once an ally of Anne, Cromwell had clashed with her over power and policy. She sought influence over church appointments and foreign alliances, while Cromwell aimed to centralize authority in his own hands. Their rivalry grew toxic. When Henry's affection for Anne waned, Cromwell seized the opportunity. He understood better than anyone that the only way to remove a queen was to destroy her utterly. Divorce had humiliated Catherine of Aragon and destabilized the realm. To rid England of Anne, Cromwell needed something far darker, treason. And so, the threads of the net were spun. Cromwell began to gather whispers, rumors, and convenient lies. He watched Anne's household carefully, noting her friendships with male courtiers, particularly the talented musician Mark Smeaton, the king's groom Henry Norris, and even her own brother, George Boleyn. In a court where gossip was currency, Cromwell wove a narrative of adultery, incest, and conspiracy, charges so lurid that their very excess would make them believable. After all, Anne had enemies everywhere: Catherine's supporters, conservative clergy, and foreign ambassadors who despised her. Few would rise to defend her. Henry, meanwhile, grew more distant. The miscarried son in 1536 hardened his heart. That same year, he was thrown from his horse in a brutal jousting accident that nearly killed him. Emerging battered and weakened, Henry seemed older, more paranoid, and more desperate than ever. To him, Anne was now not a savior, but a failure, and Jane Seymour, waiting in the wings, promised fresh hope. Anne sensed the change. Reports describe her growing anxiety, her sharpness turning to desperation. She quarreled with Henry in public, even accused him of neglecting her. But the more she clung, the more he recoiled. By the spring of 1536, the tide had turned fully. Cromwell, working in secret, prepared the charges that would condemn her. Henry, impatient for resolution, looked the other way. The queen who had once seemed untouchable was now isolated, her allies dwindling. The courtiers who had bowed at her coronation began to avoid her gaze. Foreign envoys wrote gleefully of her impending fall, and Anne herself, sharp, proud, and unyielding, could feel the shadow closing in. She had risen on Henry's passion. Now she would fall on his indifference. On May 2nd, 1536, Queen Anne Boleyn dined at Greenwich Palace. By evening, she was a prisoner. The transformation was so sudden, so merciless, that even hardened courtiers gasped at its swiftness. Summoned before the King's Council, Anne was accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother George. She reportedly laughed at the charges, certain they were too ridiculous to stand. But when the guards stepped forward and informed her she was under arrest for treason, the penalty for which was death, the Queen realized the truth. This was no game of gossip. This was annihilation. She was escorted by barge along the Thames to the Tower of London, the very same fortress where, just 3 years earlier, she had entered in triumph before her coronation. Then the bells had rung in her honor. Now, the river carried her in silence, the oars cutting through black water. One courtier noted that Anne fell down on her knees upon arrival, crying out, "O Lord, help me, I am not guilty of this." The Tower was no ordinary prison. For nobles, it was a liminal place, part palace, part grave. Anne was lodged in the very same royal apartments once prepared for her coronation, a cruel symmetry that underscored her fall. At first, she reacted with disbelief and wild shifts of emotion. Contemporary records describe her laughing, weeping, praying, and babbling in the same breath. Historians now recognize these as signs of trauma, the mind breaking beneath unbearable stress. Her jailers employed methods of psychological torture that mirrored modern interrogation. She was kept under constant guard, deprived of privacy, and questioned relentlessly. Friends and ladies were interrogated in her presence, their words twisted into evidence against her. Sleep was scarce, fear omnipresent. Meanwhile, the men accused alongside her fared worse. Mark Smeaton, the musician, was tortured until he confessed to an affair with the Queen, the only one of the accused to do so. Whether his words were true or wrung from agony mattered little. His confession became the keystone of Cromwell's case. George Boleyn, Anne's brother, was accused of incest, a charge as grotesque as it was implausible. Henry Norris, Francis Weston, and William Brereton, all courtiers of prestige, were likewise swept into the net. Their trials came first. Condemned with breathtaking speed, they were executed at Tyburn. Anne was forced to listen from the tower as the bells tolled their deaths, a calculated cruelty designed to remind her of her own fate. But if the physical tortures were reserved for the men, Anne's torment was psychological. Records describe her long hours in prayer, her frequent breakdowns, her desperate hope that Henry might relent. But Henry did not relent. He did not visit her. He did not write. Instead, he paraded his attentions to Jane Seymour more openly, ensuring Anne understood she was already replaced. Witnesses describe her as cheerful at times, speaking with grim humor about her fate. This facade of calm, however, was almost certainly a mask, a defense mechanism known today as dissociation. She had entered a strange limbo, suspended between denial and despair. Her sharp wit still surfaced. To one attendant, she quipped that she would be Queen of England for no longer than the others who had been before me, save only Queen Catherine. But beneath the gallows humor lay unbearable fear. She knew her trial was not about truth or justice. It was about spectacle. As May 15th, 1536 approached, Anne's fate was sealed. The Queen would be placed on public trial before a jury of peers, men who owed their positions to the king and whose verdict was already predetermined. The stage was set for the destruction of a queen. The Tudor courtroom was not a place of justice. It was a stage, and the actors had already rehearsed their lines. Verdicts were written long before the accused ever entered. The purpose of the trial was not to determine guilt, but to transform execution into spectacle, to make the condemned appear complicit in their own destruction. Before Anne Boleyn faced her judges, the men accused alongside her were paraded through their own sham proceedings. Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton, and George Boleyn, Anne's own brother, stood accused of adultery and treason. Smeaton, broken by torture, had confessed. The others protested their innocence with dignity, but it mattered little. A jury of noblemen, carefully selected and fiercely loyal to the king, delivered guilty verdicts with mechanical swiftness. On May 17th, 1536, the 5 men were executed at Tyburn. Their deaths served a dual purpose, eliminating Anne's supposed partners and fixing in the public mind the certainty of her guilt before she herself stood trial. When Anne was led into the hall of the Tower for her own judgment, witnesses were struck by her composure. She wore a gown of black damask with a crimson petticoat, a striking image of mourning and defiance. Though she was pale from sleepless nights, her carriage was upright, her eyes unflinching. The charges were read aloud. They accused her of adultery with multiple men, of conspiring to kill the king, even of incest with her brother. The sheer grotesqueness of the allegations left some murmuring in disbelief. But to the orchestrators of this trial, that was the point. The more lurid the charge, the more it captured imagination. Anne listened in silence, then rose to speak. Her words, preserved in fragmentary accounts, reveal a woman fighting to the last with clarity and dignity. She denied every charge, pointing out inconsistencies in the accusations, and appealed to the judgment of God. One observer noted she made so wise and discreet answers to all things laid against her, excusing herself with her words so clearly, as though she had never been guilty. But in the Tudor courtroom, reason was meaningless. The jury included men who openly despised her. The Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, presided over the trial. Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, who had once loved Anne, sat stricken and pale, yet still condemned her. Not one man dared risk Henry's wrath by voting for acquittal. The verdict was unanimous, guilty of high treason. Then came the sentencing, a moment heavy with ritual cruelty. Anne was told she would be burned, alive or beheaded at the king's pleasure. A theatrical touch meant to remind her that even the manner of her death lay in Henry's hands. She responded with remarkable calm, declaring she was prepared to meet death, and if it be His Majesty's pleasure, I am willing to suffer. Afterward, she was led back to her chambers in the Tower. The walls that had once enclosed her as a bride now confined her as a condemned traitor. Outside, the court buzzed with gossip. Inside, Anne prayed, sang, and at times laughed. Behaviors historians now recognize as signs of psychological disassociation under extreme stress. The queen who had once bent kings and cardinals to her will was reduced to waiting, hour by hour, for the blade. There is a particular cruelty in death delayed. For Anne Boleyn, the agony was not the swift fall of a sword, but the long, drawn-out hours of anticipation, when each passing moment reminded her that she lived only at the mercy of the king's whim. Henry VIII ordered her execution, then postponed it. Once, then twice. On May 18th, she awoke, believing she would die, only to be told she must wait another day. The reprieve was not mercy. It was torment. Each delay unraveled her further, breaking her spirit not with blows, but with uncertainty. Within the tower, Anne clung to faith as her last refuge. Eyewitnesses recorded how she prayed aloud for hours, sometimes singing hymns in a trembling voice. She confessed to Archbishop Thomas Cromwell, maintaining her innocence to the last. Cromwell, once her ally, could offer little beyond absolution. Even he seemed unsettled, remarking afterward that he had never lived to see such a woman. At times, Anne laughed. She joked with her attendants that she would be called Queen Anne sans tête, Anne without a head. She quipped that her neck was but little, and the executioner's task would be an easy one. Such humor shocked her ladies, who wept openly in her presence. But beneath the jokes lay something darker, the psychological disassociation of a woman staring into the abyss. The night before her execution, Anne requested the sacrament at 2 o'clock in the morning. She spent hours in prayer, kneeling until her legs trembled, hands clasped tightly as if she might hold back the dawn. She prayed for the king, for her daughter Elizabeth, and for her enemies, words that masked despair with ritual piety. Sleep eluded her. Guards reported that she paced her chamber, muttering prayers, sometimes breaking into sudden laughter or weeping fits. This fractured behavior reveals the human cost of Tudor justice, the mind unraveling under unbearable strain. By the time morning came on May 19th, Anne had been awake for nearly 24 hours. She dressed carefully, choosing a gown of black with a red petticoat, the colors of martyrdom and sacrifice. Over her shoulders, she placed a mantle of ermine, the symbol of queenship, as though determined to meet death as a sovereign, not a traitor. Her ladies assisted her, though their hands shook as they pinned her hood and arranged her sleeves. They knew they would be forced to perform the grisly duty of handling her body after the execution, and several could hardly contain their grief. Anne, by contrast, appeared eerily calm, speaking words of comfort to them, even thanking them for their service. When the lieutenant of the tower came to escort her to the scaffold, he found her laughing with her attendants. To him, it was not the laughter of joy, but of a woman broken by fear and exhaustion, clinging to fragments of composure as the end drew near. As she was led from her chamber, Anne passed through the same stone corridors she had once walked as queen on the eve of her coronation. Then she had been greeted with trumpets and banners. Now the only sound was the echo of her footsteps on cold stone, followed by the muffled sobs of her ladies. Outside, the sun shone unnaturally bright. The crowd gathered at Tower Green, eager for spectacle. Nobles filled the inner yard, while commoners jostled for glimpses from beyond the walls. The air buzzed with anticipation, the murmur of voices swelling as word spread that the condemned queen was approaching. Anne walked calmly, her head held high, but her hands trembled as she clasped a small prayer book. Every step carried her closer to the scaffold, a low wooden platform hastily constructed for the occasion. Unlike the grand, towering stages often depicted in later art, this one rose only a few feet from the ground. It forced Anne to face her spectators eye to eye. Stripped of dignity, a condemned woman among the jeering crowd, she mounted the steps with measured grace. The scaffold creaked beneath her weight, the silence heavy, broken only by the restless shuffle of feet. At that moment, Anne Boleyn stood at the threshold between life and death, between history and oblivion. Executions in Tudor England were not simply punishments. They were performances, acts of power meant to terrify, humiliate, and instruct. And on May 19th, 1536, all eyes turned to Tower Green for the most sensational performance of Henry VIII's reign, the execution of his queen. The scaffold was low, only 3 feet high, denying Anne the dignity of towering above her spectators. The crowd pressed close, nobles in their finery standing alongside soldiers and officials. For them, this was not tragedy but theater, a moment to witness the downfall of a woman who had once reigned over them. Anne mounted the steps with poise. She was dressed in black with a crimson petticoat, her ermine mantle removed before she knelt. In her hands, she clutched a small prayer book. Witnesses remarked on her composure, calm, almost serene, though beneath it, fear must have screamed within her. Tradition demanded a final speech, and Anne delivered hers with precision. She praised Henry as a gentle and sovereign lord, thanked God for her blessings, and urged the crowd to pray for her soul. Notably, she confessed no guilt. Instead, she framed her words carefully, acknowledging the law but denying wrongdoing. It was a masterstroke of survival, not for herself, but for her daughter Elizabeth, whose future might yet depend on the Queen's final show of submission. To modern ears, her words may sound meek, but in truth, they reveal the impossible bind she faced. A condemned queen could not openly accuse her husband without sealing her child's doom. Anne spoke, therefore, not in freedom but in restraint, her voice the echo of a woman already silenced by power. Then the ritual began. Anne removed her headdress, her long dark hair tucked away beneath a linen cap. She handed her prayer book to one of her ladies, who could not restrain her sobs. The executioner, a French swordsman summoned from Calais, stepped forward. His presence was both practical and theatrical. Practical, because the sword ensured a swift stroke, unlike the often botched axe. Theatrical, because his foreignness emphasized the drama of the moment. Anne was blindfolded, not as mercy, but as necessity. The executioner's technique required her to remain absolutely still. She knelt upright in the French style, hands clasped in prayer, her slender neck stretched forward. Witnesses noted her lips moved constantly, whispering the words of a final prayer. And then, silence. The executioner, trained to reduce panic, called out for his sword, distracting Anne into turning her head slightly. In that instant, the blade was already in motion. One clean horizontal strike severed her neck. Her head fell, lips still moving, eyes blinking, a grotesque reflex that chilled those who watched. Some later claimed she whispered prayers even after the blow. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several fainted. Others cheered, as instructed, to reinforce the king's justice. Blood soaked the scaffold, the crimson of her petticoat blending with the crimson of death. The executioner lifted Anne's head by the hair, displaying it to the crowd. This ritual, the moment of triumph for authority, reduced a Queen of England to a lifeless trophy. But the indignities did not end there. No coffin had been prepared. In the chaos, her grieving ladies were forced to scramble for a container. They found only an arrow chest, far too small, into which they placed her body and head. With trembling hands, they carried her remains to the Tower Chapel, where she was buried hastily in an unmarked grave. No prayers were said, no solemn rites performed. A queen, discarded like refuse. Witnesses recorded the despair of her attendants, women who had dressed her for coronation and now clothed her for burial. Some never recovered, haunted for years by the memory of their queen's severed head. Anne Boleyn's death was not merely the execution of a woman. It was a carefully staged message, a warning to any who might rise too high, and especially to women who dared to challenge the king's will. But Henry VIII's cruelty did not end at the scaffold. Beyond the Tower walls, another erasure had already begun, the systematic destruction of Anne's memory. Death was not the end of Henry VIII's vengeance. For Anne Boleyn, the sword had severed her body, but her memory was placed upon the block as well. Henry was determined not only to kill her, but to obliterate her existence, to reduce her to nothing more than a cautionary tale. The morning after her execution, Henry wore white, the color of celebration, not mourning. That same day, he became formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. Within 2 weeks, they were married. Anne's blood had barely dried on Tower Green when she was replaced, her crown resting on another woman's head. To justify this swift transition, the king's propagandists worked tirelessly. Poems, ballads, and sermons painted Anne as a seductress, a witch, a traitor. Her execution was reframed as an act of mercy. The skilled swordsman, not the axe. Presented as Henry's compassion, in truth it was spectacle rebranded as kindness. Anne's portraits were removed from palaces, her insignia chiseled from stone, her badges erased from tapestries. To speak her name at court became dangerous. She was meant to vanish, leaving no trace. Even her grave was unmarked, her body hidden beneath the Tower Chapel without ceremony. But perhaps the cruelest blow fell upon her daughter. Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate. The child of an adulteress, stripped of her title, she was demoted from princess to Lady Elizabeth. Her household was dissolved, her clothing and servants reduced to the bare minimum. The little girl who would one day become the greatest monarch in English history was, in that moment, abandoned. For those who had served Anne, the trauma lingered. Her ladies-in-waiting, forced to carry her severed head to burial, suffered nightmares and grief. One withdrew from court life altogether, unable to endure the sight of palace walls that had witnessed such cruelty. The courtiers who had once bowed to Anne learned a harsher lesson, that proximity to power could bring not honor, but ruin. Henry's terror extended beyond Anne. By executing a queen, he demonstrated that no one, not even the crowned consort of England, was safe. Fear became the coin of his court, silence its language. And yet, despite his efforts, Anne's memory did not vanish. Whispers persisted. Some pitied her, others condemned her, but none could forget her. Foreign ambassadors recorded her downfall, poets mourned her beauty, and chroniclers noted the shocking spectacle of a queen's beheading. In time, history shifted. The child Henry had tried to erase would rise to power. When Elizabeth I ascended the throne in 1558, she carried her mother's bloodline back to the pinnacle of England's destiny. Though Elizabeth rarely spoke of Anne, her reign was in many ways a vindication. The young daughter of the concubine became the Virgin Queen, ruler of an empire, a sovereign who would outshine the very father who had sought to erase her. Anne's execution became more than a personal tragedy. It became a lens through which generations would examine the brutal realities of power, gender, and politics in Tudor England. She was destroyed, yes, but she was also remembered, pieced back together by historians who sifted through the fragments Henry tried to bury. The horror of Anne Boleyn's fate lies not only in the clean stroke of a French sword, but in the deliberate campaign to unmake her, the psychological torture of delays, the public humiliation of her trial, the ritual performance of her execution, and the attempt to erase her very existence. Hers was a death designed not just to silence a woman, but to rewrite reality itself. And yet, in the end, Henry's efforts failed. Anne's daughter would rule for 45 years, reshaping England and leaving a legacy that eclipsed Henry's. The queen he tried to erase became, through Elizabeth, immortal. But to stand in Tower Green today is to feel the shadow of that May morning in 1536. To imagine the low scaffold, the sunlit crowd, the whispered prayers cut short by steel. To remember that beneath the legend was a woman, ambitious, flawed, brilliant, and doomed, who suffered the most complete destruction Tudor power could deliver. Anne Boleyn's story is not merely one of death. It is a testament to the fragility of truth under tyranny, to the ease with which power can warp justice, and to the enduring human struggle against erasure. Her head may have fallen, her name may have been blackened, but 5 centuries later, we speak it still.